There is a moment that happens in almost every dying relationship, every failed negotiation, every collapse of respect moment, so small, most men don't even notice it. It happens when he begins to explain himself, not because he's been asked, not because clarification is needed, but because he feels the weight of her doubt, her silence, her withdrawal. He believes that if he can just make her understand, everything will stabilize. He doesn't realize that the very act of explaining is what seals his fate. You can see it in the way his texts get longer, the way he starts justifying decisions he's already made, the way he prefaces every boundary with 3 paragraphs of context, as if his authority requires a defense. He thinks he's being mature, communicative, and emotionally intelligent. What he doesn't see is that with every additional sentence, he's teaching her and himself that his word alone isn't enough, that his presence requires permission, that his frame is up for debate. I work with men who come to me confused. They've done everything right, they say. They've been honest, vulnerable, and clear about their feelings. They've explained their intentions, their fears, their logic, and somehow the woman who once pursued them now looks at them with a kind of tired indifference, or worse, a subtle contempt that neither of them can name. He doesn't understand what changed, but something did. And it wasn't her. It was the moment he began negotiating for respect, instead of simply inhabiting it. Friedrich Nietzsche spent much of his life studying this exact dynamic, though he never framed it in terms of modern dating. He called it the will to power, and he understood that all human interaction is fundamentally about who holds the frame, who sets the terms, who can afford to remain silent while others scramble to explain themselves. Nietzsche saw that power isn't taken through force, it's surrendered through weakness. And there is no faster way to communicate weakness than to over-explain yourself to someone who has already decided what they think of you. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly why explanation destroys authority and what it quietly costs you every time you do it. Nietzsche lived in the 19th century in a Europe that was beginning to lose its nerve. The old certainties, religion, monarchy, tradition were crumbling, and in their place was rising a new kind of human being, uncertain, introspective, desperate for validation. Nietzsche watched men become philosophers of their own inadequacy, endlessly analyzing themselves, endlessly explaining their existence to a world that had stopped listening. He saw this as a sickness, a retreat from life itself, and he would recognize the modern man immediately, the one who texts a paragraph when a single sentence would suffice, the one who, when his woman questions his decision, launches into a detailed breakdown of his reasoning, his feelings, his thought process, hoping that if he just explains it well enough, she'll respect him again. But she won't, because respect doesn't come from understanding, it comes from certainty, and certainty cannot be argued into existence. Here is the thesis that runs beneath everything Nietzsche wrote and everything you're about to read. A man who explains himself is a man who has already conceded that his authority is conditional. And once authority becomes conditional, it ceases to exist. Let me show you what this looks like in the real world. A man meets a woman. Early on, he's relaxed. He makes decisions without preamble. When he suggests plans, he doesn't follow up with, "But if you don't want to, we can do something else." He just suggests them. When she texts something passive-aggressive, he doesn't write back immediately with a clarification and an apology. He lets it sit. Maybe he responds hours later with something short. Maybe he doesn't respond at all. And she's drawn to this, not because he's rude, but because he seems unmoved by her emotional weather. He seems to operate from a center that doesn't require her approval. Then something shifts. Maybe they sleep together. Maybe she says something that makes him feel like he's at risk of losing her. Maybe he just gets comfortable and stops paying attention. Whatever the catalyst, he starts explaining. She asks where he was last night. He gives her a minute-by-minute breakdown, even though she didn't ask for it. She seems upset about something vague. He writes her a long message, trying to diagnose what went wrong and how he'll fix it. She questions a boundary he set. He defends it with logic, with emotional reasoning, with references to past experiences. He thinks he's being a good communicator. But what he's actually doing is teaching her that his decisions are negotiable, that his boundaries are opening arguments, not final verdicts, that his authority is something he has to earn from her every single day through explanation and justification. And quietly, without either of them naming it, her respect begins to drain away, Nietzsche would say, "This man has committed the cardinal sin of the weak. He has made his existence a case to be argued rather than a force to be reckoned with. He has descended from actor to defendant. And no woman, no person can respect a man who puts himself on trial every time she raises an eyebrow." Here's what Nietzsche understood that most men don't. Explanation is a status signal. When you explain yourself, you are implicitly communicating that the other person sits in judgment over you, that their understanding is required for your position to be valid, that you need their approval to proceed. And the moment you communicate that, you have placed yourself beneath them in the invisible hierarchy that governs all human relationships. This doesn't mean you never communicate. It doesn't mean you grunt and nod your way through life like some caricature of stoicism. It means you distinguish between sharing and defending. Sharing is when you speak from abundance, from a place of choice. Defending is when you speak from scarcity, from a place of fear. One preserves your frame, the other dismantles it. I once spoke to a man who couldn't understand why his girlfriend had grown cold. He was doing everything right, he insisted. He was attentive, communicative, and emotionally available. I asked him to show me their recent text exchanges. Every message he sent was 3 times longer than hers. Every time she expressed mild confusion or doubt, he wrote back with a full emotional essay. Every time he made a decision, he preemptively explained it before she even asked. He thought he was being considerate. What he'd actually done was train her to see him as someone who needed her permission to exist. Compare this to another man I know. His woman once asked him why he'd been distant that week. He said, "I've been focused on work." She pushed. "Are you upset with me?" He said, "No." She waited for more. He didn't give it. She was frustrated for a day. Then she softened. Then she pursued him, not because he was playing a game, but because his reality was stable enough that he didn't need to defend it. He let her feel her feelings. He didn't try to manage them, and in doing so, he communicated something she found irresistible, that he was unmoved by her attempts to destabilize him. This is what Nietzsche meant when he spoke of the will to power. It's not about domination. It's about the ability to hold your frame while others try to pull you into theirs. It's about being the kind of man whose word is enough, whose silence carries weight, whose decisions don't require a footnote. But how does this collapse actually happen? How does a man go from self-possessed to self-negating, often without even realizing it? It starts with a feeling, a tightness in the chest, a slight anxiety when she doesn't text back, a hyper-awareness of her mood shifts. He tells himself this is normal, that caring about someone means being attuned to them, and that's partially true. But what he doesn't realize is that he's begun to outsource his emotional stability to her reactions. Her approval has become the currency by which he measures his worth, and once that happens, explanation becomes inevitable. Because if her perception of him is what determines his value, then managing that perception becomes his full-time job. At first, the explanations are small. She misunderstands something he said, and instead of letting her sit with her misunderstanding, he rushes to clarify. She seems annoyed, and instead of giving her space to process it, he asks what's wrong, then explains why he did what he did, then preemptively apologizes just in case. He thinks he's being responsible. What he's actually doing is teaching her that her emotional discomfort is his emergency, that her doubt has veto power over his reality. Then it escalates. He starts explaining things she didn't even ask about. He justifies his time with friends, his need for alone time, his career decisions, and his past relationships, not because she's interrogating him, but because he's begun to internalize her as his judge. He's begun to see his own life through her eyes, and in doing so, he's abdicated his own perspective. He's no longer the author of his existence. He's the defendant in a trial that never ends. Nietzsche called this the slave morality, the psychological posture of those who have learned to see themselves as inherently guilty, inherently in need of justification. The slave doesn't act and then stand by his actions. He acts and then explains, defends, negotiates, and apologizes. He lives in a state of permanent self-interrogation, and women, operating on instinct rather than ideology, sense this immediately. They may not have the language for it, but they know. They know when a man is living from his center and when he's living from her reflection of him. And here's the cruelest part. The more he explains, the less she believes him, because deep down she knows that a certain man doesn't need to convince anyone. A man who is grounded doesn't need to defend his ground. The very act of explanation becomes evidence of doubt, and doubt, in the realm of attraction and respect, is death. I've watched this play out in dozens of relationships. The man grows increasingly verbose, the woman grows increasingly quiet. He interprets her silence as a need for more information, so he provides it. But her silence isn't a request, it's a withdrawal. She's pulling back not because she doesn't understand him, but because she's lost respect for a man who seems to need her understanding to exist. Meanwhile, he's spiraling. He's not sleeping well. He checks his phone constantly. He rehearses conversations in his head, trying to find the perfect way to phrase things so she won't misinterpret him. He stopped going to the gym as often because he's worried that time away from her might create distance. He's abandoned the projects and friendships that once gave his life structure. He tells himself this is love, this is commitment, this is what it means to show up for someone. But Nietzsche would say this is slave morality in its most insidious form, the belief that self-erasure is virtue. That shrinking yourself to accommodate someone else's comfort is maturity. That explaining yourself into oblivion is emotional intelligence. It's not. It's slow suicide. And the woman, even if she doesn't consciously recognize it, begins to feel it. She begins to feel the weight of being his emotional center. She begins to resent the responsibility of managing his sense of self. She may even start picking fights, testing him, trying to provoke the old version of him, the one who didn't need her approval, who could weather her moods without collapsing into explanation. But he's gone, and in his place is a man who has become a walking apology. Now zoom out. This isn't just about one man and one woman. This is a pattern that repeats across the entire landscape of modern male-female dynamics, and it's rooted in something deeper than individual psychology. It's cultural, structural. Nietzsche would call it a symptom of decadence, the late stage of a civilization that has lost its instinct for hierarchy, for power, for the uncomfortable truths that govern human nature. We live in a time that tells men their authority is inherently suspect, that masculinity itself requires justification, that taking up space, setting boundaries, and making decisions without extensive consultation is a form of violence. Men are taught from boyhood to explain themselves, to soften themselves, to treat their own instincts as dangerous and in need of constant regulation. And then we're surprised when they enter relationships without any sense of internal authority, when they defer to women not out of respect, but out of fear, when they negotiate for affection like it's a hostage situation. The modern dating landscape amplifies this tenfold. On dating apps, men are disposable, replaceable. They know that for every message they send, she has 50 others waiting. They know that one misstep, one moment of unfiltered masculinity, and they're gone. So they learn to explain, to soften, to preemptively apologize, to present themselves not as men with their own reality, but as accommodating, flexible, endlessly understanding. They think this is what women want. And maybe in the abstract it is, but in practice it repels them. Because what women respond to, what all human beings respond to, is not moral correctness. It's certain. It's the felt sense that this person knows who they are and will not be moved by the winds of social approval. Nietzsche knew this. He knew that the mass of humanity does not respect those who bow to it. It respects those who stand apart from it, who refuse to explain themselves into acceptability. And when a man loses this, when he becomes a creature of endless justification, he doesn't just lose her respect, he loses his own. He becomes a stranger to himself. He looks in the mirror and doesn't recognize the person staring back. He wonders when he became so small, so cautious, so desperate for approval. He wonders when his life stopped feeling like his own. Nietzsche would say this is the cost of denying the will to power. When you refuse to inhabit your authority, when you outsource your sense of self to others, you don't become more moral or more connected. You become hollow. You become a shell animated by other people's expectations. And eventually, even the people you were trying to please can't stand to be around you, because there's nothing there to relate to. Just a man-shaped absence, endlessly explaining why it should be allowed to exist. Here's the line that needs to be tattooed on the inside of every modern man's eyelids. If you require someone's understanding to respect yourself, you have already lost both. And here's the second line. She doesn't take your authority. You hand it to her every time you explain yourself without being asked. This is the machinery of status decay. It doesn't happen in one conversation. It happens in 1,000 micro moments where he chooses explanation over presence, justification over silence, negotiation over decision. Each moment is small, but they accumulate. And eventually, the man who once walked into the room with quiet confidence is now a man who can't make a dinner reservation without a paragraph of preamble. So, what does the alternative look like? How does a man who understands Nietzsche move through the world differently? First, he notices when the urge to explain arises. He feels it, that tightness in the chest, that need to clarify, to justify, to make sure she understands. And instead of immediately acting on it, he pauses. He asks himself, is this explanation necessary, or am I defending myself against the judgment that hasn't even been made? Most of the time, it's the latter, and most of the time, the explanation would do more harm than good. Second, he learns to let misunderstandings exist. This is perhaps the hardest skill for modern men to develop, because we've been taught that all misunderstanding is a problem to be solved. But it's not. Sometimes, letting someone misunderstand you is the only way to find out if they're interested in knowing you, or just interested in controlling you. If she's genuinely curious, she'll ask. If she's testing you, she'll wait to see if you flinch. And if you flinch, if you rush to explain yourself without being asked, you failed the test. Third, he keeps his words scarce and his actions abundant. Nietzsche had little patience for people who spoke constantly about their intentions, their values, their principles. He believed that what you do is who you are and everything else is just noise. A man who lives by this doesn't need to explain his boundaries because his actions make them obvious. He doesn't need to justify his priorities because his schedule reflects them. He doesn't need to convince anyone of his value because his life is the evidence. Fourth, he refuses to manage other people's emotional reactions. This doesn't mean he's cold or dismissive. It means he understands that her feelings are hers to process, not his to fix. When she's upset, he can acknowledge it without absorbing it. He can be present without being responsible. He can let her feel whatever she feels without explaining himself into her good graces. And paradoxically, this is what allows intimacy to exist, because real intimacy requires two separate people. And if he's constantly collapsing into her emotional state, explaining himself, trying to preemptively smooth every rough edge, there's no separation. There's just codependence dressed up as connection. Fifth, he becomes comfortable with loss. This is the ultimate test, because the fear that drives over-explanation is always the fear of loss, of losing her approval, her affection, her presence. And as long as he's afraid of losing her, he will explain, he will negotiate, he will shrink. But the moment he accepts that he might lose her, that he might lose anyone, and that his life will continue regardless, that's the moment he stops explaining. That's the moment his authority returns, not because he's playing aloof, but because he's genuinely at peace with whatever happens. Nietzsche wrote that the free spirit is the one who has overcome the need for others' good opinion, not because he's arrogant, but because he's found something in himself that doesn't require external validation. He's found his will to power his capacity to create his own values, his own meaning, his own sense of what matters. And once he's found that, explanation becomes unnecessary. He simply is, and people either recognize it or they don't, and either outcome is acceptable. There are two paths in front of you now, two futures, and the choice you make in the next weeks and months will determine which one you inhabit. In the first future, you ignore this. You tell yourself that over-explaining is just being thorough, that justifying yourself is just being considerate, that defending your boundaries with paragraphs of reasoning is just healthy communication. You continue texting her essays when a sentence would do. You continue preemptively apologizing for things you don't actually regret. You continue letting her moods dictate your emotional weather. And 5 years from now, you wake up in a life that doesn't feel like yours. You're with someone who doesn't respect you. Maybe the same woman, maybe a different one, but the dynamic is identical. You've become smaller, quieter, and more careful. You've learned to anticipate criticism before it arrives. You've learned to edit yourself in real time, to be whatever you think others need you to be. And the worst part is, you can't even remember when it started, when you stopped being yourself and became this other thing, this accommodating, over-explaining, perpetually defensive version of a man. You look around and realize you've built your entire life around avoiding disapproval. And it's a prison. In the second future, you take this as an initiation, You recognize that you've been living in a frame that isn't yours, speaking in a language designed to make you small. And you stop, not dramatically, not with some performative declaration of independence, but quietly. You start saying less. You start letting silence do the work that explanation used to do. You start making decisions and standing by them without the footnotes. When she questions you, you answer once, clearly, and then you let it be. You stop managing her emotional reactions. You stop defending yourself against accusations that haven't been made. You reclaim your time, your attention, your sense of purpose. And it's uncomfortable at first. People are confused. She's confused. She might even pull away. But you don't chase. You don't explain. You let reality speak for itself. And slowly, something shifts. People start treating you differently, not because you're performing dominance, but because you've stopped performing submission. You've stopped negotiating for respect. And in the space where explanation used to live, authority quietly returns. Not the kind you have to announce, the kind that people feel when you walk into a room. In 5 years in this future, your life will be unrecognizable. You have fewer people around you, but the ones who remain are there because they actually see you, not because you've convinced them to stay. You have a woman who respects you, not because you've managed her perception, but because you've given her nothing to manage. You've simply been clear, consistent, and unmoved. Your work is better because you're no longer splitting your attention between the task and the anxiety of how others perceive you. Your body is stronger because you stopped abandoning your discipline every time someone needs something from you. Your mind is quieter because you've stopped living in a state of permanent self-defense. You've become the kind of man who doesn't need to explain himself. And that, more than anything else, is what people respect. Here it is again, in different words. A man who must defend his authority has already lost it. This isn't about arrogance. It's not about refusing to communicate or treating people with contempt. It's about understanding that respect is not won through explanation. It's commanded through presence. And presence cannot be argued into existence. She does not destroy your authority. She simply reveals how little of it you were holding to begin with. Every time you over-explain, you're teaching the world and yourself that your word alone isn't enough, that your frame is up for debate, that your existence requires a lawyer, and the world will believe you. She will believe you. You will believe you. Nietzsche spent his life trying to wake men up from this trance. He knew that most people sleepwalk through life, animating scripts written by others, defending positions they don't even believe in, explaining themselves to judges who were never appointed. He knew that real freedom, begins the moment you stop explaining, the moment you reclaim your authority, not by taking it from anyone, but by simply ceasing to give it away. If this hit something in you, if you felt the weight of recognition as you read it, then do 2 things. First, share this. There are men in your life who need to hear it, who are drowning in explanation and don't even know it. Second, subscribe and keep this work alive, because the insights that matter most are the ones the algorithm tries to bury. And finally, remember this. The moment you stop defending yourself to people who never asked for a defense is the moment you become unshakable.